Let's face it, humans tend to be obsessed with technology. Our news, our films, the stories we create show a fascination with robots and artificial intelligence. The creatives in the CMC audience might take comfort in the fact that the industry isn't ready to replace you with robots just yet, but big tech is keen for us to buy into its vision of automation, machine learning, and a metaverse. The way in which computers assist us to navigate content has a massive impact on the media business, but how is it impacting young people themselves? Should we be paying closer attention to how AI-driven algorithms, and more specifically recommendation systems, are driving a saturated digital landscape?
Most people don't understand how algorithms are working because, for example, YouTube is not just one algorithm. It's a number of different algorithms that are working together, and they'll work differently depending on where you are and your previous media usage. You might also be someone who is participating without your knowledge in an A/B testing initiative by the platform. So you might be seeing completely different content through the algorithmic recommendations that you're getting than someone else who has a very similar profile from you. So it's extremely difficult as an outsider to understand how algorithms practically work. And even as someone working in a social media platform or working for a social media platform, you'll probably just be working on one very small area of that platform or one very small area of that platform's algorithms, and you won't have a holistic understanding of how that comes together. And there's a lot of people who, want to sell kinds of expertise in how algorithms work, but actually it's very difficult for them to practically do that because of the challenges that, I just discussed. So taking that kind of algorithmic expertise with a pinch of salt, I think is, important. But I would add one caveat to that, which is, professional platform users, so like influencers and maybe like producers and talent managers and people involved in those areas of content creation, like people who really do use the platform frequently for a lot of different media products and are really interacting with all elements of the platform. Those are the people that I think actually have like a bigger overview and a more comprehensive overview of how these platforms are working. So really, we should be listening to content creators and producers when they're raising concerns about how the algorithm might be working, for example, in terms of marginalization or in terms of depressing content because it might have, for example, LGBTQ themes, which we've seen on YouTube. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing. Having transparency, I think a lot of platforms would say, they wouldn't even be able to be transparent about how their algorithms worked, even if they wanted to, which they definitely don't. But there are sort of pieces of the puzzle that we can bring together. And generally, the best way to do that is through collective action and knowledge sharing and listening to the people who are using the platforms all the time.
Algorithms, like a lot of technologies, like a lot of successful technologies, give their creators extraordinary power over the rest of us. And as Spider-Man's uncle once told him, with great power should come great responsibility. But it seems we're quite a long way from that. To give you just one example of the power of algorithms, I think we can look at YouTube. So YouTube had an interesting thing where their original algorithm that determined what video came up next when you were watching on YouTube was finding something that came to be known as the Gangnam Style effect, where lots of people were ending up at the same place. And they were ending up watching the video to Gangnam Style because that at the time was the most popular video on YouTube. And so they tweaked the algorithm so that rather than just getting a slightly more popular version of the video that you were watching, you would get a video that was more in your particular niche based upon your previous viewing habits. And this contributed to what became known as the echo chamber effect. So people were being recommended increasingly extreme and occasionally weird content, all because of YouTube's desire to get people to stay on the platform longer. And that, one could argue, contributed to the polarization of a lot of people's viewing habits on that particular on that particular medium?
So when we're thinking about streaming platforms for kids, and in that I would think of, the big broad streamers that we all know, like Netflix and Disney Plus. And then I'd also always call out YouTube as arguably the biggest streaming platform for kids today. There's kind of two sides of the coin. On one side, you have Netflix, who are very, very committed to their algorithmic recommendation system. It's kind of one of their USPs that they cling to very much so in terms of what of the product offering that they put out there. So the whole algorithm is, the whole programming presentation is all driven by the algorithm. No human touches within it, allegedly. And that's quite an interesting way of running a content offering. What we're seeing, what I'm seeing in terms of the discussion that's in news articles and quotes I've seen online is that HBO Max and Disney Plus are going to take a hybrid model to algorithmic curation, so that they're going to, yes, there will be an algorithm, and yes, there is an algorithm driving what people are seeing, but they are definitely going to be curating some human curation of the homepage screen, which makes a lot of sense for those businesses because they've got franchise priorities that they're needing to push, whether the algorithm likes it or not, if you know what I mean. On the other side of the coin of that, I see is YouTube. Yes, YouTube is very algorithmically driven, but the basis of it is far more social. It's much more, it kind of came up through the social media kind of set. And because of that, its recommendation engine is quite different to that of Netflix. And also its kind of visual user experience IP is quite different. And I think the way that YouTube works in terms of curating content, recommending content is a lot more native to what kids are used to, what kids want. And I think on the more traditional media streamers, I think there's maybe a disconnect with how content is served and how kids are finding content. Because the thing is, if a kid likes something, once something's off their home screen, it's a search away. And a search from a user experience point of view is an immediate barrier twice, thrice over when you're a kid, obviously, because you've got to go in and you've got to put in the letters, it's got to be the right way. So that's the way I see the landscape in terms of the different systems that are out there.
We really do need data about that, offers a nuanced perspective around how children do interact with YouTube, particularly with YouTube and other media, for example, like TikTok. And this is particularly because, it's such an individualized experience for children. They're often consuming this media on their own rather than in a sort of family space where there would be other sort of family members there who are able to monitor this. So I think, it really is an area that needs a lot more user research and research into audiences. And we're kind of playing catch up. And it's also a tricky thing due to the fast moving nature of the space. And a lot of colleagues, for example, are researching YouTube and children's relationship with YouTube, but does that actually apply as we move into TikTok? And we also move into other kinds of apps that children are using, for example, secret telling apps and apps that are, like less kind of visible. So yeah, more information needed.
Another big issue is algorithmic transparency. So we all get recommended particular content. One of the questions that we might be interested in is why did we get shown this one thing? So how do we understand the decisions that were taken by the algorithm to direct us to this particular place? How did I end up here? And there we have a problem because algorithms we've seen in various ways are not transparent. They might be proprietary, protected by their creators in order to keep hold of their trade secrets, but also they might be just technically really hard to understand. So they'd be known as black boxes by a lot of people, which for those of us that want to understand what technologies are doing to us, which could be all of us really, might be a source of big concern.
I think it's important not to stereotype young people, first of all. Some children are anxious and cautious and maybe only use one or two communication apps, while others use all of them and have been using TikTok, Insta, YouTube since primary school. So for those immersed in digital culture, the online environment is fragmented and chaotic, and events and people tend to have no historical or cultural context. So, for example, they wouldn't associate the Kardashians with the O.J. Simpson trial, for instance. And this means that they often turn to influencers to help them make sense of reality. And there's an army of influencers ready to interpret, for example, the Depp Heard trial for them. So young people will come across all this content that is sort of fired at them. And it's really hard for them to make sense for it. And they might turn to influencers to help interpret that for them. I think this is problematic because via likes, shares, and the engagement algorithms, that they always prioritize sensationalist and outrage-inducing and misleading information in ways that can spiral out of control. So news becomes whatever is emotionally satisfying and what's going to get a reaction from followers and friends rather than what should be meaningful. So we lose that sort of like normative hierarchy of what is important and what isn't. It all collapses into this big mush. And it's really hard for young people to make sense of that.
On streamers, and certainly on Netflix, we can see this focus that bingeability is the key thing. And kids definitely binge content. You know, we all know that as professionals and as parents. But they don't binge it in the same way. And that, I think that's a concern that I see on streaming is that, and again, we're seeing with Netflix, you know, content makers who are making content for Netflix are getting 7-day and 28-day ratings, which is essentially measuring bingeability, which might be great when you're releasing Stranger Things. And it might be great when you're releasing Maid, you know, or the Queen's Gambit or whatever, right? But kids binge content in a different way, and they binge it on their own terms. Of course they do, because they're kids. So, you know, it might take longer, and it usually does take longer than 7 or 28 days for something to grow. We've definitely seen that on, you know, I definitely saw that on Paw Patrol, which I monitored as a core competitor of mine for a number of years. Like Paw Patrol was like, you know, 18 months in before it really started popping.
In many ways, we've abandoned young people to the algorithms and to the business model of what we call in the trade platform capitalism, where the algorithm suggests what you should be reading or watching, and this again, if young people find it really hard to make sense of it, especially if they haven't been. If their educational background is found wanting.
So in the online space, we're moving away from traditional platforms and unleashing algorithms to help us navigate entertainment, news, and social media that forms a continuum of content. But in turn, young people are relying on new kinds of curation in the forms of influencers who have their own agendas. Influencers aren't something we'll dwell on here, but clearly the online space is getting more complex, and the promise of the metaverse, which is an all-encompassing immersive digital world procedurally created by gaming technologies and powered by artificial intelligence and machine learning, adds to that complexity.
Thank you for having me here today. I guess the first question that you have is, are we in a new age with AR and VR? And I don't think we are. I think that if you've used a QR code on your phone or Snapchat Lens or an Instagram filter, you've already engaged with AR and the age of the metaverse. It just kind of creeps up on you slowly, so you don't realize that the adoption curve starts small and then gets big before you see any fundamental hardware shifts.
Virtual reality and, generally speaking, immersive technologies are going to revolutionize basically every kind of sector. We are going to learn them even better than we are now doing with the screen-based technologies. We are going to connect with our peers wherever they are, overcoming the challenges of just the Zoom calls on a 2D screen. We are going to even buy things or being convinced about buying things because in immersive technologies, we can just try some elements and understand if they fit in our preferences. And of course, we are going to use also immersive technologies in healthcare to support rehabilitation, to support psychotherapy, to support pain management in the hospital. So there is a huge potential out there in the new interfaces, both augmented reality and virtual reality.
Positives about what we might achieve with with this kind of technology, it's really incredible. I love AR and VR because of the potential for education and creativity and really the augmenting of human potential, not just augmenting reality.
When we use traditional screen-based technologies, the computer, our smartphone, even smart TVs and many other the tablets, of course, there is one key aspect. We as audience, we are separated from the digital content that we can experience in the screen, on the screen. And this separation is fundamental because we can be engaged, we can be very committed to the digital content that we are looking at, but we are still separated from that. We are still part of the physical world surrounding us, and we are still in contact with all the things that are happening around us. When we change the paradigm and we embrace the paradigm of immersion in a virtual context, we change the interface. We still use a screen, sorry, but basically, we as audience, we become part of the digital content. We are inside of the digital content. We go beyond the screen. And this change, this shift of paradigm determined by the immersivity generates the so-called sense of presence. The sense of presence is when our brain starts reacting to virtual stimuli as if they were real.
Children have a harder time distinguishing virtual reality from actual reality. So when you ask them what happened, they will tell you the content of the experience as if it were a physical, tangible experience. We also don't know the impact on sort of the spatial reasoning and coordination of children. There's some studies that say this could impact them, but nothing's definitive yet. There's also studies that talk about empathy and how, on one hand, these type of mediums can engender great empathy. So that's something that is wonderful for children. But on the other hand, there's also studies that have just come back that said, well, it also can reinforce implicit bias in people because they feel like they have seen and experienced what it's like to be another person and walk around in their skin. And you know what? It wasn't that bad. So more research needs to be done to answer the question how AR and VR really does impact our conception of empathy towards others.
So there are a lot of opportunities out there, but of course, this opens also many back doors for potential breaches, for crimes, for potential risks that probably people are going to commit also in virtual worlds and in the future metaverse. We're already doing that today online. Nothing removes the possibility to do the same potential crimes and even new kind of crimes in the metaverse. So we need to take into consideration the benefits and the risks of these new innovative hardware interfaces and technologies.
When you look at the way that AR and VR environments affect the brain, the bottom line is there's a lot we don't know. We don't know more than we do know, but what we do know should indicate that this is an area to proceed with caution, especially when you're thinking about children. The way that you experience an event or an interaction in AR and VR is the same way that your hippocampus processes memories. So to your brain, it is an actual reality. There are these three properties of AR and VR: presence, immersion, and embodiment. And those all work together to make you feel like you're really there and that this is your actual world for the time that you're in the headset. Because your brain interprets it as your actual reality, this opens up great potential for things like therapy and education and virtual travel and communication with family and friends. But on the other side, it also means if somebody's being abusive to you, it doesn't sound like reading harsh comments on Twitter or Facebook. It sounds like they're actually sitting next to you at your dinner table and screaming in your face. So I'm a former prosecutor. And when people describe being sexually harassed or physically assaulted in AR and VR environments, they actually use the same language, have the same body language, and have the same trauma as I recognized when I used to prosecute those cases. So you want to be careful with the type of content that you allow your children to look at, because it's as real as where you're sitting today.
Now, immersive technologies, virtual reality, for instance, is cheaper than ever, is more affordable, is easier to use, is well connected. So you can, of course, navigate social spaces that are shared with many other peoples out there. So the immersive technologies and virtual reality are spreading on the market. They are actually becoming mass consumer technologies. So what that means? It means that you're going to cover and provide and deploy these kind of technologies to more people out there, but also to more potential vulnerable people. And this is important because when you statistically cover more people, there are a lot of people with vulnerabilities whose vulnerabilities can be triggered and can be, of course, negatively impacted by this new paradigm of experiencing and using digital technologies. And this is even more important when we consider that more and more young individuals are going to use immersive technologies.
There's much to be excited about and lots to explore, but it seems we should be mindful of the fact that this new hardware and the software behind it has the potential to amplify existing issues within our digital world. Ultimately, are we doing enough to look after our young people now whilst making preparations for the future?
I've done some research into how young people's class and education impacts the digital environment and the way they engage with tools like Google. And to cut a long story short, if children are left to their own devices and not educated and not supported by media literate adults around them, they have little idea what's going on. They don't understand how Google works, how Google prioritizes results, the difference between adverts and reliable content, and they tend to distrust everything except a select few of people they think they can trust. And again, it comes back to the concept of influencers. So the influencer can tell them things that are not true, and they trust those people because their friends trust them, and they sort of think of them as part of their social network.
It's interesting to think about who the recommender systems are serving. I mean, obviously, are they serving the audience of the business? To drive the business, you need to serve the audience, because the audience needs to be watching content to drive the business. I think when we think of the likes of YouTube, is the system gamed to be serving kids best in class, excellent content? I'm not sure I see that. I mean, I know they're obviously investing. They've got their fund and they're investing in great kids content, that lots of which is very high quality. But, the bottom line is with platforms like this is they want users to be using them. And then that goes, when we go over to streamers, it's like some of the deals that have been done more recently on YouTube style content and potentially people will look down their nose on that type of content and say, oh, it's not as high quality. But, if that's what kids are watching, then we have to meet them where they are, and there is a whole, hemisphere, stratosphere of content that's come up through YouTube and YouTube style content that is, is a kind of a genre in of its own, really.
So Charisma applies AI to storytelling. That is our focus. And naturally, this is a combination of games and storytelling. We're really keen to get something working for kids and for the kids market. At the moment, this is simply too hard in our view, because we want to protect the kids and make sure that the AI data sets we have are appropriate to the market. We're working hard to make sure that that comes to fruition, especially with academic partners like Oxford University. But I think there's a little way to go before we can be confident that we can provide a service to the kids that is respectful to them.
With the DCMS inquiry that I was doing, like one of the things that we really wanted to do was sort of add an extra layer of regulation to ensure that children weren't being exploited by about influencer content and weren't seeing content that was inappropriate for children. But one of the things that there was a really big issue around was age verification, and platforms weren't ensuring that actually that was being upheld. So, you know, there's a lot of different issues. Like there's supposed to be specific children's versions of social media platforms, but actually it's very easy for children to sign up for a 13 plus or a 16 plus profile. So, you know, there's many issues here. But yeah, I think, you know, a lot of the issues do lie in the fact that this is, you know, it's an advertiser-funded space, but also it's an advertiser-funded space again that kind of operates outside of these the regulation and oversight of traditional commercial media.
The way that most companies at this point verify age is through stated age, meaning someone creates an account and they tell you how old they are, and that impacts what they can see and what they cannot see. So what parents might want to do is look at some of the new parental controls that are coming out. There's a guide from an organization called Connect Safely that came out this week about how to navigate these new parental controls, which will tell you how long your children are spending in AR and VR, what they're looking at, and help you age gate content that is appropriate. The reality is, even though the hardware says it's 13 and up, many children are using this now. If you go into any sort of VR chat mechanism, you're going to find lots of children exploring their identity, talking to people, doing what kids do in a new space, which is testing the boundaries. And many families will have one headset that they all share. So it's very important to be aware not only of the experiences that are out there, but how the hardware will layer the cake, if that makes any sense.
Now, a lot of parents are buying, of course, virtual reality headsets. They are not looking so much at the risks of this technology. They are not looking so much at age limitations that are written, that are present in the manuals, but they're just providing it because they think about these technologies as potential toys, like the consoles in video games, traditional video games. So what that means, on one side, we are providing a cognitive technologies that impact how our brain works, how we build our behaviors and identities and social relationships to a target individuals that are vulnerable. So young individuals are all about development. They are undergoing development as it comes for their body, their mind, their identity, their behavior, their social connections. So we are going to impact children with these new technologies. And how are we going to impact? There is still not so much research about this. So when we see that Meta or other companies are stating that the age limitations are at around 13 years old, we need to make another consideration. Just researching more, going deeper in the topic, everybody can see that the age limitations of 13 years old is not based on evidences, is not based on scientific evidences, is first of all a bureaucratical strategy, because it's probably connected with the so-called COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Rule, that states that when tech providers, when tech companies deals with individuals below 13 years old, they are required to perform specific actions. to manage correctly and in a safe way the data that they can collect. So the move to avoid that young individuals below 13 years old are not able to use those technologies is not about their safety. It's about the safety, of the bureaucratical infrastructure of big tech who don't want to deal with these complications.
So most hardware producers will tell you that the AR/VR hardware that they are making is designed for children 13 and up. And if you look at the way that the content is being produced, there's a bit of a mismatch there. If you go to Harry Potter's monster creation lab, that really doesn't sound like something that a 17-year-old would be as interested in as a 7-year-old.
So, of course, it's good to say there is an age limitation, but let's connect that age limitation with research, with evidence. Some years ago, the age limitation was around 7 years old. So why this shift? So we need definitely to promote better research to understand when digital technologies and immersive technologies are able to negatively impact the development, the cognitive dynamics, the behavior of children, and based on those data, set up a real-world, data-driven, data-based age limitation in the manuals. So this is something that will require a more horizontal discussion or reflection between tech providers, research, scientists working with children, and of course, families and all the stakeholders out there.
I think the way to get the right people around the table is to look at who you intend to market this to and the type of communities that are going to be your customer. I've seen a lot of missed opportunities in the AR and VR sector because when people were designing the hardware originally, they didn't take into account differences in men and women's physiology, which has resulted in a lot of women getting simulation sickness based just on the distance between their pupils not matching to the standardized measurements that were made because the headset was designed for somebody who was, 2 meters tall and of a higher weight than the average female form. These systems are also not well designed for people with disabilities. There was an update to Oculus, it was update 30, little more than a year ago. And that was the first time that they changed the vantage point so that people who were seated could actually appear and look like they, and have the vantage point of standing in a metaverse. The hardware also doesn't incorporate different types of ethnic hairstyles and textures. A woman took her Oculus Go to Nigeria to do some postdoctoral research, and the straps snapped 50% of the time she tried to put it on her subjects.
The whole business model of Silicon Valley, regardless of the sector, for example, in accommodations, Airbnb, in transport is Uber, and in social media it's Facebook. They all want to scale as quickly as possible. So the holy grail is maximum scale. And that means they deal with consequences. They scale first and deal with the consequences later. So they can't, for instance, deal with the amount of disinformation and conspiracy theories on YouTube and Facebook with algorithms alone. And they have to rely on the freelance content editors to sieve out all the problematic content. And once they get to such a scale, they can't do that. So the onus comes on, the responsibility comes on to schools, comes on to young people to decode the information for themselves. And I think the platforms could do a lot more in addressing that problem. I think they need to have more localized solutions. They need to be more reactive and they need to empower young people to customize their digital environment and support parents as well.
In a moment, we'll look at long-term solutions that might help us deal with the technology we've been discussing. But for the producers and creatives in the CMC audience, what might be done right now in terms of getting ideas and projects seen in the ever-expanding digital landscape?
I suppose when I think about content makers and what they can be doing to game these services or to kind of be surfaced on these services, when we're thinking of the traditional streamers, the Netflix system is difficult because it's 100% algorithmically driven. The main moment that your content has an opportunity to shine is day one when it's released. Day one when it's released, you can have some confidence that it's going to be served in the what's new lists. It's going to be surfaced in that kind of an area. What you ideally want to do is try to use that spark to light a bit of a flame so that you're pushing people to watch on day one so that you then get served again on day two, and you kind of stay in that visual real estate. You stay above the fold of the streaming service, if that makes sense. That's a term we use when we're talking websites, but it is something that you kind of need to think about when you're talking streaming services as well. The other thing I would specifically see on Netflix, they seem to have a real love of Christmas content. They commission so much kids' Christmas content each year. So if you're doing a big episode order and you can squeeze in a Christmas episode or a holiday episode, that seems to be something that they're quite into, and you would assume that will get your content served in Christmas lists over the holiday season, which is great, a peak viewing season anyway. YouTube is different because YouTube, there's a bit of a playbook that's been there, that's been built over time because it's social, and because when we're talking about data disclosure, everybody has their data and everybody's able to talk about it, and there's this kind of radical transparency in that regard. There is somewhat of a playbook that you can employ. It's not straightforward, and it changes every day as things on the algorithm and on the platform change. But there are people out there who've made it work, and there's there's strategies and recommendations about. The main thing is content volume. You can't just start a YouTube channel. You need to have a YouTube channel is a hungry beast. It needs to be fed regularly. It needs to be fed, weekly, and you need to have like a 1-year plan minimum to get going on that service. And with that, then there's other little tactics that you can employ to help to surface your content. And obviously, the easy thing with YouTube is that you can just do paid spend against content. There's schools of thoughts. Again, it's not a set. The playbook is there to be interpreted. There's no set, do this, and you will have success. There's just different tactics and strategies that you can bring in. So that's kind of there's kind of quite the flip side of two different things. And I think the interesting thing about it is, on one side of the coin, you have the big streamers who don't disclose much data at all. And on the other side of the coin, you have YouTube that has this, again, radical transparency about its data. Anybody can go on and see, how many views something's gotten. That's not to say that makes it easier, by the way, because sometimes too much data is overcomplicates the picture also.
So what we're really focused on in Charisma is applying AI to storytelling. And what that means is that the data sets that we use, the algorithms that we use, and the approach that we use is creative and story first. And we create all of that technology specifically for storytelling. Now, what that means in turn is actually that the engagement levels we're seeing from audiences are a lot longer than a lot of people are talking about. I think we're used to conversations around fragmented audience times and attention spans of a couple of minutes. But actually, by bringing characters to life that audiences want to engage with, they want to engage for a longer period of time, hours rather than minutes.
Currently, there's much discussion about online harms, but should we be equally exercised about creating positive spaces whilst encouraging positive habits that can be amplified within the metaverse? We asked our CMC experts to talk about solutions for some of the challenges that lie ahead.
I think we're thinking about algorithms wrong on the whole. So we tend to get stuck in a slightly sort of science fiction trap where we're comparing algorithms to their human equivalents, right? We watch a chess computer playing chess and we see it beating a human and we think the robots are taking over. I think we need to think about I think we need to think about algorithms differently. So algorithms don't just substitute for human labor. We don't just put an AI in to do a human's job. They don't just substitute, they tend to transform systems. So a self-driving car doesn't really drive like a human driver. A recommendation algorithm doesn't work like a human editor does. And in order to understand the effects of these things at scale, we need to start seeing algorithms for what they are, which is changes to the infrastructure of our everyday life.
The most important thing is that all the stakeholders that create society, that creates the innovation ecosystem, the organizations, the young individuals, their families, and so on, we definitely need to acknowledge and recognize that immersive technologies are a technology which is not exactly the same as online technology. As I said before, it's different to see something on a two-dimensional screen than immersing in that content and becoming part of that content. The effect is more compelling when it comes for immersive technology. So we need to understand and we need to recognize as a society that XR technologies open new opportunities, but also new potential risks that are different from the general topics of online safety.
Media literacy should be part of the solution, but it's, from my point of view, it's not taken seriously by the UK government. It's very much left to the schools to teach it on an ad hoc and discretionary basis. It's not on a national curriculum, for instance, and it's not included in the EBAC. So other subjects like maths, English, science, modern foreign languages are prioritized over media studies, or subjects that would give young people media literacy. Now, I'm more optimistic about the situation in Scotland because we have, I'm based in Scotland incidentally, we have the modern studies curriculum, which allows for much more flexibility and to deliver a media literacy within its content.
Of course, children are not one homogeneous population. This is a very composite population made of different age groups. So as stated by the ICO in the UK, in the Children's Code, there are 5 age groups when it comes for children. So we need to consider these aspects. We need to consider these diversities within the children's population and how changes also the oversight by adults, by guardians, by educators, by families. When building controls, we need to address all this diversity or this complexity and build controls that can be used by the different kind of stakeholders that control the process of providing immersive technologies, creating content, and experiencing the final immersive technologies. So at XRSI, the most important thing is build this framework right now, which is a community effort, and provide this framework as a benchmark to inspire a more sustainable, safer, and healthcare innovation when it comes for immersive technologies and all the users, but especially the young individuals.
Ethics in AI has been a core pillar of what we do at Charisma. We've written papers about ethics in AI datasets. We've won awards for it, and we do it from the top down. And that, for me, is critical in this space. We need to make sure that anyone who is looking at AI from an ethical perspective has the attention of the board and is on the senior management team. And specifically what that means is that they have the ability to make non-profitable decisions based on an ethical direction. And I think we've seen a number of examples recently where ethics advisors, indeed entire ethics teams, have left or have been pushed to one side because the decisions that they've been recommending are non-profitable. That to me is a mistake. You have to have that ethics at the core of a new business. And it's not only about short-term profit, it's about long-term sustainability, responsibility, and indeed, ultimately the success of the company. A good ethical company will always be more profitable than a company that is not.
The platformization, as a lot of people phrase it, So, how the media that we consume is now more and more facilitated by social media platforms and how it's made visible, is that is, a very commercially orientated sort of political economic model. So social media platforms' main income is from advertising, and so really they are very interested in maintaining advertising revenue on the platform, and that can come sometimes at the expense of for example, children, of young people, of certain marginalized groups as well. So that's a really big concern. But it's not new. Sort of media has always been, some media has always been commercially funded, which has led to issues around representation and certain kinds of audiences being more valuable than others. And the BBC kind of offers this public service response to that. And so I think we do know the answer is having publicly funded media, having regulation that really speaks to some of these issues in terms of, for example, representation and discrimination. That would be a great way forward, but it's extremely tricky because platforms say they're not media companies, and there's many lawyers that are working on, sort of trying to work out regulation that will actually speak to those concerns at the moment. So it would be great to have a public service algorithm or a public service platform. And, also I think this is where some of the work around news and journalism, like how they split revenues with platforms, like they've raised, like newspapers and other media companies have raised concerns about this really not being a fair deal. So in terms of compensation for media that's hosted on platforms like YouTube, having some kind of fair compensation for that is a really important part of the puzzle too.
The problem with the Silicon Valley business model is it overloads young people with globalized content that is very difficult to make sense of. I think part of the answer now is public service broadcasting that's localized, that helps young people make sense of the reality and is sensitive to their needs and reflects their local culture and community.
It's funny because like in this world where we have so much choice, it does get harder to choose, and algorithms, it would seem, can only go so far. Either it's the surfacing of content that could be good, or the buildability of content isn't being kind of serviced, and so the question of human creation comes back in, and it's so funny because it becomes part of a cycle rather than an evolution that humans, it was human created, then algorithms are a thing, and now we're actually going back to saying, well, actually that human touch is an opportunity. And I do think it's an opportunity. I don't know how you commercialize it. I don't know how you commercialize tastemakers when it comes to content. But I do think, particularly with kids, where, like I said, that we need this buildability for the bigger, for the big brands, they take time to stick. I think having services where, people are able to go to get recommendations, I think is a real opportunity. And you can see this come up with the big streamers. Netflix has what's on netflix.com, which, side note, I do write for, but, all of the big streamers now have those partner websites that stand independently of them, and are, essentially, they're now legitimized in how established that they are, to help users and viewers figure out what they want to watch, figure out what they might want to watch in this massive ocean of content that's kind of pretty hard to navigate, because obviously the algorithms aren't doing it the total justice that we as humans needed to do.
Much of the research we explored to put together this film suggests that we need to better understand how technology of all kinds impacts on young people. And in the end, we might equally focus on the intentions of the institutions who deploy the technology. As we debate the future of the BBC and regulation of online activity, we might also consider how technology can be deployed to serve the public. Public service that encourages sound business practice and an appreciation for high quality cultural experiences.